Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew, and today we're entering Matthew chapter 23. This is the one extended account of Jesus delivering woes in the Gospels, although he does deliver woes, and in this context, in the other synoptic Gospels, we have the full extent of what Jesus has to say about the scribes and Pharisees. This is delivered in the temple itself. Jesus is there. He has just dealt with the questions that those in authority, Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes, have brought to him. And then he gave them this unanswerable question, which really was an answerable question if they would think about it. These are men who have the knowledge and the intellectual ability to answer the question that Jesus had given them if they had bothered to. And that would have led them to the truth. And they rejected that exercise. And so now Jesus is speaking to the people, particularly about the scribes and the Pharisees. He doesn't include the Sadducees in on this. Some of the complaints that he makes about the charges that he makes about the Pharisees would have also been true of the Sadducees, but the Pharisees had the ear of the people. They were leading the grassroots of Judaism. The high priests may have controlled the temple, but the Pharisees controlled the synagogues. Generally speaking, they did throughout the empire. In fact, it is the Pharisaic faction that will survive the destruction of Jerusalem. Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the Mishnah, will survive. Will survive in the Roman destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And Judaism as it exists today is descended from this movement. And so the readers of Matthew's Gospel would, and the readers of the book of Hebrews, would have been dealing with the influence of this particular group. And I think that's why Matthew makes sure we listen to all Jesus has to say about this group. So we're going to begin reading verses 1 through 12. Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you to do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. And they tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments, and love the places of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called by men rabbi. But do not be called rabbi, for only one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, and that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." So in this chapter, in the first place, we talked about 5 sermons, and this is not one of them. This is a delivery of woes. This is not technically a sermon. All the 5 sermons in Matthew end with the same phrase, or immediately followed by the same phrase, which is, "and after Jesus had finished saying these things." And that's how you know that a sermon has come to an end. You have that phrase. It ends all 5 of the sermons, and we don't have it at the end of chapter 23. We may connect chapter 23 with chapter 24, but I don't think these are the same setting, and they deal with the same issues. This is just not a sermon. It's a delivery, as an Old Testament prophet would, a series of woes. He hasn't gotten to the woes yet. He gets to those in verse 13. He begins by putting the Pharisees in perspective and the scribes, and he says basically they know what they're talking about when they stick to the word and talk about observing the law. based upon the word. When they're sitting in Moses' seat, whenever they're talking about the law itself, the text of the law, and what it means to observe the text, when they stick to the Bible, listen to them, because they know it. It's not about them knowing the actual text, it's what they do with it and how they don't live it. His complaints about them begin here, that they do not practice what they preach. They're going to, because of that, do damage to others in verses 13 through 15. He takes issue with the way they use Scripture to apply it to people's lives, their hermeneutic, in verses 15 through 22. He's going to circle back to their hypocrisy in verses 23 through 28, and he's going to demonstrate how, because all these things are true, they have become not the protectors of God's law, but the very enemies of God. The first thing he says is that they want preeminence. They like being the big shot. They like the titles. And God isn't saying that your teacher isn't your teacher, or your earthly father isn't your earthly father, or that you can't call your dad your dad. He's talking about the love of titles. And he says, no, we don't have that system. You're all brothers. You're all brothers. And if someone wants to exalt themselves above you, then God has a problem with that. That has nothing to do with who we are in the kingdom. He talks about the way they do things for show. He talks about the phylacteries. These are the little boxes in which they would, which would contain a line of scripture, and they would tie that to their forehead, or they would take leather thongs, and in the way they wrap the thongs around their arms, they would spell out Hebrew words from the Bible. The tassels on their prayer on their prayer shawls. And Jesus is wearing one. I mean, we know that Jesus wore one because the woman with the hemorrhaging touched the tassel of his garment. The tassels, they would make them long. Jesus has already talked about this when he talked about the way they pray and the way they fast, the way they love the show. And he's already been teaching all along that the greatest has to be the servant of all. He's bringing this to bear specifically in the example of the Pharisees, and how they may have the education, but they do not in any way measure up. And so do not use them as your template. Not at all. And he's going to speak directly to the scribes and Pharisees, beginning in verse 13. And we will talk about that in Jesus' tone of voice as he's saying these words when we're together next time. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes.